When I found the personal letter hidden inside that rusted fighter jet, I never expected it would lead me to fulfill a World War II veteran's dying wish and change my entire understanding of what it means to honor our heroes. Before we dive in, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. My name is Zara Hendricks, and 6 months ago, I was just another broke 24-year-old trying to keep my grandfather's aircraft salvage yard from going under. I spent my days covered in engine oil, wrestling with corroded metal, and talking to myself in an empty workshop that still smelled like Dutch's Lucky Strike cigarettes. People in town called me crazy for thinking I could run Peterson salvage yard alone, and honestly, most days I agreed with them. I never imagined that one dusty tarp in the corner of our workshop would hide a secret that Dutch had kept for over 40 years. Underneath that canvas sat Lady Liberty, a pristine P-51 Mustang fighter plane that, according to military records, had been missing in action since 1944. But that wasn't the real discovery. The real discovery came when I opened the cockpit and found something that made my hands shake so badly I almost dropped it. Tucked behind the pilot's seat was a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, addressed in fading ink. For Vivian, from Daddy. Inside that envelope was the last letter Captain Theodore Blackwood ever wrote to his daughter, a letter that had been waiting 79 years to be delivered. I'm a mechanic, not a historian. I fix engines, not broken hearts. But when I realized that somewhere out there, an old woman might still be waiting for her father to come home from a war that ended before I was even born, I knew I had to find her. What I didn't know was that this decision would save not just her life, but mine too. This is the story of how a forgotten fighter jet taught me that some promises are worth keeping, no matter how long it takes. It's about the daughter who never stopped believing her father would find a way to say goodbye, and the grandfather who spent decades protecting a secret that wasn't his to tell. My grandfather Dutch always told me that every plane has a story, but some stories choose when they're ready to be told. Lady Liberty had been waiting for the right person at the right time, and somehow, that person turned out to be me. To understand how that letter changed everything, you need to know what my life looked like before I found it. 6 months earlier, Dutch Hendricks, my grandfather and the only father figure I'd ever really known, suffered a massive heart attack while rebuilding a Cessna engine. I found him in the workshop at 7 in the morning, tools still in his hands, a half-finished crossword puzzle on his workbench that he'd never complete. Dutch raised me after my parents died in a car crash when I was 12. He taught me everything about aircraft mechanics, not because he thought I'd make it my career, but because he believed working with your hands could heal a broken heart. He was right about that, at least for a while. The problem was, Dutch was better at fixing planes than managing money. When the lawyers finished sorting through his estate, I inherited Peterson Salvage Yard, along with $63,000 in debt, a mortgage 3 months behind, and a workshop filled with half-finished restoration projects that nobody wanted to buy. The bank gave me 90 days to bring the payments current, or they'd auction everything off to pay the creditors. I was working 18-hour days, 7 days a week, surviving on coffee and determination. My hands were permanently stained with engine oil, and I'd developed this habit of talking to Dutch's photograph on the workbench while I worked. I don't know what you were thinking leaving me this mess, I'd tell him. These planes were your passion, not mine. I'm just trying not to let you down. My younger brother Camden called every few days from college, always offering to drop out and come help. Zara, you don't have to do this alone, he'd say. Let me come home and we'll figure it out together. But Camden was a sophomore at Oklahoma State studying business, and he had a future ahead of him. I wasn't going to let Dutch's financial mistakes destroy both our lives. The truth was, I felt like an imposter in that workshop. Dutch could diagnose engine problems just by listening to them run. He could look at a pile of scrap metal and see the beautiful aircraft it used to be. Me? I was just following his repair manuals and hoping I didn't make anything worse. 3 weeks before I found Lady Liberty, I got a call from a collector in Dallas who wanted to buy Dutch's 1943 Stearman trainer. It was the closest thing to finished in the entire workshop, and the sale would buy me another month before foreclosure. But when I went to move it out of the way to get better access, I discovered something strange. The steerman was parked directly in front of a corner of the workshop that I'd been avoiding since Dutch died. It was the darkest section, filled with what I assumed was just more junk covered by old tarps. But the way the steerman was positioned, it was almost like Dutch had deliberately blocked that corner from view. Curiosity got the better of me. I spent an entire afternoon moving the steerman and clearing away years of accumulated stuff. Old toolboxes, engine parts, stacks of aviation magazines from the 1970s, 3 broken lawnmowers that Dutch could never bring himself to throw away. Finally, I reached the back corner and found a massive shape under a paint-splattered canvas tarp. When I pulled that tarp away, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Sitting there like it was waiting for me was a P-51 Mustang fighter plane in remarkable condition. The original olive drab paint was still visible under decades of dust. The propeller looked like it had been recently serviced. Even the tires still held air. But here's what made no sense. Dutch had never mentioned owning a P-51. Not once in all our years together had he said anything about having a World War II fighter plane hidden in his workshop. Dutch told me stories about every aircraft he'd ever worked on, but this one, it was like it didn't exist until the moment I uncovered it. That should have been my first clue that this plane was different, that it was carrying secrets Dutch never intended to share. The moment I climbed into that P-51's cockpit, I knew this wasn't just any fighter plane. The serial number on the instrument panel read 4472891, and when I cross-referenced it online, my stomach dropped. This was Lady Liberty, a plane that according to official military records had been shot down over the Pacific Ocean on March 15, 1944. The pilot, Captain Theodore Blackwood, was listed as missing in action, presumed dead, but Lady Liberty wasn't. At the bottom of the Pacific, she was sitting in my grandfather's workshop, and she'd been there for decades. I spent the next 3 days researching everything I could find about Captain Blackwood and his missing aircraft. The more I learned, the more confused I became. Theodore Blackwood was a decorated pilot from Tulsa, Oklahoma, just 2 hours from our salvage yard. He'd flown 37 combat missions before disappearing on what should have been his final sortie before rotating home. The financial implications hit me immediately. A restored P-51 Mustang could sell for anywhere from $2 to $4 million. Even in her current condition, Lady Liberty was worth enough money to save the salvage yard 10 times over. I could pay off Dutch's debts, keep the business running, and still have enough left over to send Camden through college without him worrying about student loans. But then I found Dutch's personal notebook hidden beneath a stack of aviation manuals, and everything got complicated. The notebook contained pages of research about Captain Blackwood, newspaper clippings from 1944 about his disappearance, and copies of correspondence with military historians. But the entry that made my hands shake was dated just 3 months before Dutch died. Teddy's family deserves the truth, but I made a promise 40 years ago. Some secrets aren't mine to tell. When the time is right, someone else will have to finish what I started. Dutch knew exactly whose plane this was, and for some reason, he'd been hiding it. I called the National Archives in Washington and spoke to a researcher named Patricia who specialized in missing World War II aircraft. When I mentioned Lady Liberty and Captain Blackwood, there was a long silence on the phone. Then she said something that changed everything. Captain Blackwood has a daughter who's been searching for information about her father for 79 years. Her name is Vivian Blackwood Chen, and she's still alive. Vivian was 82 years old and living in a nursing home in Tulsa. According to Patricia, she'd spent her entire adult life trying to find out what happened to her father. She'd contacted the military, hired private investigators, and even traveled to the Pacific to search crash sites. She'd never married, never had children, because she said she couldn't move forward with her life until she knew her father's fate. That night, I sat in the cockpit of Lady Liberty and tried to figure out what Dutch would want me to do. The practical part of my brain screamed that I should sell the plane immediately. Camden called while I was sitting there, and when I told him about the discovery, he said exactly what I expected. "Zara, this is the answer to all our problems. You can't save every story from the past. Sometimes you have to save yourself first. But Camden didn't understand what it felt like to sit in that cockpit. Captain Blackwood's personal effects were still there. A St. Christopher medal hanging from the instrument panel, a wedding ring taped to the dashboard, and most unsettling of all, a sealed envelope wedged behind the pilot's seat with "For Vivian, from Daddy," written in fading ink. I realized I was holding a father's final words to his daughter, words that had been waiting 79 years to be delivered. How could I sell this plane to a collector or museum when Captain Blackwood's daughter was still alive, still searching for answers about what happened to him? The moral weight of that decision kept me awake for 3 straight nights. I had 90 days to save Dutch's business, but I also had the power to give an 82-year-old woman the closure she'd been seeking her entire life. On the 4th sleepless night, I made my decision while sitting in Lady Liberty's cockpit at 2 a.m. The workshop was quiet except for the sound of rain on the metal roof, and I could almost feel Dutch's presence in that old plane. I pulled out my phone and called Camden, knowing he'd be awake studying for midterms. "I'm driving to Tulsa tomorrow to meet Vivian," I told him without any preamble. There was a long pause before Camden responded. "Zara, you have 6 weeks left before the bank forecloses. 6 weeks. You can't afford to play detective right now." "I can't afford not to," I said. "If I sell this plane without giving his daughter a chance to see it, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. Dutch kept this secret for 40 years for a reason." Camden's voice got that worried tone he used when he thought I was making emotional decisions instead of practical ones. What if meeting her makes things worse? What if she can't handle the truth? You could be opening old wounds that never properly healed, but I'd already made up my mind. Then at least she'll know what happened to her father. Some wounds need to be opened before they can heal properly. The next morning, I spent 3 hours documenting every detail of Lady Liberty before making the drive to Tulsa. I photographed the cockpit from every angle, took close-ups of Captain Blackwood's personal effects, and carefully cataloged everything I found. The St. Christopher medal was engraved with TB March 1943, obviously a gift before his deployment. The wedding ring was a simple gold band that looked like it had never been worn, probably purchased for a wedding that never happened, because of the war. But it was the sealed envelope that made my hands shake every time I touched it. The paper was so old and brittle that I was afraid it might crumble if I handled it wrong. Whatever Captain Blackwood had written to his daughter, it had been waiting in that cockpit for 79 years. Sunset Manor Nursing Home sat on a tree-lined street in Midtown Tulsa, a brick building that looked more like someone's grandmother's house than an institutional care facility. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for 20 minutes, rehearsing what I was going to say to Vivian. How do you tell someone that you might have found their father's missing aircraft? How do you explain that you're holding a letter he wrote to them before he died? The receptionist, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, looked surprised when I asked to see Vivian Blackwood Chen. "Vivian doesn't get many visitors," she said. "Are you family?" "Not exactly," I replied. "I think I have some information about her father." Mrs. Rodriguez led me down a hallway lined with photographs of residents and their families. She stopped outside a door marked with a small nameplate, V. Blackwood Chen. "She's probably in her chair by the window," Mrs. Rodriguez said quietly. "She spends most afternoons looking at old photographs." When I knocked and entered, I found Vivian exactly where Mrs. Rodriguez said she'd be. She was a small woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a lavender cardigan and holding a photo album in her lap. When she looked up at me, I saw eyes that were still sharp and intelligent despite her age. "Are you the young woman who called about my father?" she asked, and her voice was stronger than I'd expected. "Yes, ma'am. My name is Zara Hendricks." I sat in the chair beside her window. "I think I found his plane." Vivian set down her photo album and looked at me with an intensity that made me understand where Captain Blackwood had gotten his courage. "Tell me everything," she said. For the next hour, I explained how I'd discovered Lady Liberty, what I'd learned about her father's disappearance, and why Dutch had kept the plane hidden for so many years. Vivian listened without interrupting. occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions that showed she'd spent decades researching every detail of her father's military service. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I knew he was trying to come home." To me, I could feel it. The next day, I returned to Sunset Manor with the sealed envelope. Vivian was waiting for me in the activities room, dressed in her best blue dress with a pearl necklace that she said had belonged to her mother. Her hands were steady as she reached for the envelope, steadier than mine had been all week. "I've been preparing for this moment my entire life," she said quietly. "Every birthday, every Christmas, every Father's Day for 79 years, I wondered what his last words to me might have been." She examined the envelope carefully, running her fingers over the faded ink that spelled out her name. "This is definitely his handwriting," she whispered. "He used to leave me little notes in my lunchbox before school." When she carefully opened the envelope, 2 folded pieces of paper fell out, along with something small wrapped in cloth. Vivian unfolded the letter first, and I watched her face change as she began to read silently. Tears started falling before she'd finished the first paragraph. "Would you like me to read it aloud?" I asked. She nodded, unable to speak, and handed me the letter with trembling hands. "My dearest Vivian," I began, and my own voice started to shake. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home to teach you how to drive or walk you down the aisle or meet the grandchildren I hope you'll have someday. But know that every single day I lived for the hope of seeing your smile again." I paused to let Vivian compose herself. She was crying openly now, but she motioned for me to continue. "I'm writing this 3 days before what I know will be a dangerous mission. The intelligence reports say it's heavily defended, and I have a feeling I might not make it back. I want you to know that if something happens to me, it won't be because I was careless or reckless. It will be because I was trying to end this war sooner so I could come home to you." The next paragraph contained details about the mission that weren't in any official records. Captain Blackwood had been part of a secret reconnaissance flight to photograph Japanese positions on a heavily fortified island. His plane had been shot down, but he'd managed to crash land instead of going down in the ocean. I survived the crash and made it to a small island about 50 miles southeast of our target. I'm hurt pretty badly, but I've managed to build a shelter and find fresh water. I'm writing this because I found some supplies washed up from other crashed planes, including paper and a pencil. I've been here for 6 weeks now, and I don't think rescue is coming." Vivian gasped. Her father hadn't died instantly in the crash. He'd survived for weeks, alone and injured, still thinking about her. The letter continued. "I've buried my personal effects under the largest palm tree on the north side of the island, including your mother's locket and all the photographs I carried of you. If someone ever finds this letter and manages to locate the island, those things belong to you. The coordinates are written on the back of this page." I turned the paper over and found a hand-drawn map with detailed coordinates and landmarks, proving that Captain Blackwood had kept hope alive even in his final weeks. But it was the final paragraph that broke both our hearts. "Vivian, I need you to promise me something. Don't spend your life waiting for me to come home. Fall in love, get married, have children, travel the world, laugh until your sides hurt. Live the life I always dreamed you'd have. Be brave, be kind, and remember that love never truly dies. Even when I'm gone, I'll be watching over you, proud of the amazing woman I know you'll become. All my love forever, Daddy." The small wrapped cloth contained her mother's engagement ring, which Captain Blackwood had been carrying to give back to Vivian as a keepsake. Vivian held the ring to her heart and said through her tears, "I kept my promise, Daddy. I lived, but I never stopped missing you." Then she looked at me and said something that changed everything. "He has one final request in here. He wants his plane donated to a museum so other families can learn about the sacrifices made during the war." 3 weeks later, I stood beside Vivian in the cockpit of Lady Liberty for the last time, before she was transported to the National Museum of World War II Aviation in New Orleans. Vivian had insisted on making the trip to the salvage yard, even though the journey from Tulsa exhausted her. She wanted to sit where her father had sat, to touch the controls he'd touched, to feel connected to him in the place where he'd written his final letter. "Thank you for keeping your promise, Daddy," she whispered, running her hands over the instrument panel. "I lived just like you asked me to." Watching her in that moment, I finally understood why Dutch had hidden the plane for so long. He hadn't been protecting a secret. He'd been waiting for the right person to carry out Captain Blackwood's final wish. That person had to be someone who would understand that some things are more valuable than money, someone who would choose honor over profit. The donation process took 2 months to complete, but it came with unexpected benefits. The museum provided a substantial tax deduction that helped with Dutch's debt, and they paid a finder's fee that gave me enough breathing room to restructure the remaining loans. More importantly, the story of Lady Liberty and Captain Blackwood's letter generated national media attention that brought customers to Peterson Salvage Yard for the first time in years. But the real transformation happened inside me. I realized I'd been approaching Dutch's business all wrong. I thought I was just fixing old airplanes, but what I was actually doing was preserving stories. Every aircraft that came through our shop had been someone's dream, someone's lifeline, someone's ticket to adventure or freedom or service to their country. Camden came home the day we loaded Lady Liberty onto the transport truck. He'd driven straight through from Stillwater after his last final exam, arriving just as the museum crew was securing the plane for transport. "I'm changing my major to nonprofit management," he told me while we watched the truck disappear down the highway. "If you're going to turn this place into a museum, you're going to need someone who knows how to run one properly." That summer, we transformed half of Dutch's workshop into the Peterson Aviation Heritage Center. We started small, reaching out to military families who had questions about missing aircraft or wanted to donate artifacts. Our first case was a woman from Texas whose uncle had disappeared in a B-17 bomber over Germany. We didn't find his plane, but we connected her with other family members she never knew existed, all searching for the same missing airman. Within a year, we were handling dozens of cases. Families would send us photographs, serial numbers, and half-remembered stories, and we'd spend weeks tracking down leads. Sometimes we found definitive answers. More often, we found fragments that helped piece together bigger pictures. Every discovery felt like fulfilling Dutch's unfinished promise to Captain Blackwood. Vivienne became our most dedicated volunteer, spending 2 days a week at the Heritage Center, sharing her research techniques and helping other families navigate military archives. She told me once, "I wasted 79 years being angry at the war for taking my father away. Now I'm spending whatever time I have left helping other people find their peace." 6 months after we donated Lady Liberty, Vivienne passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her memorial service was held in the Heritage Center, surrounded by photographs and artifacts from all the families we'd helped. Camden read a letter she'd left for me that said, "Thank you for teaching an old woman that it's never too late to find your purpose." I keep that letter on Dutch's old workbench, right next to his photograph. Sometimes when I'm working late and the shop is quiet, I still talk to him like I used to. But now, instead of asking for help, I tell him about the families we've reunited, the stories we've preserved, the promises we've kept. "I finally understand what you were trying to teach me, Grandpa," I said to his picture last night. "It was never about the planes at all. It was about the people who flew in them, and the people who loved them. Thank you for trusting me to finish what you started,